The father brings the child and he says, Jesus, I brought my son to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Would you heal my son? And Jesus says, all things are possible for those who believe. Sounds good. And the old man says, I believe. Fix my unbelief. In other words, I believe, but I don't believe. I don't know. Yo, welcome back to another Bible study with me. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and today we are going to be going over Matthew chapter 17. Now, before we do, I just want to tell you that in a couple weeks, we're going to be having some changes to the channel. We're going to be expanding. We're going to be doing some more Bible studies, but some different kinds of Bible studies. And what we're going to be talking about is the Apostle Paul. Specifically, the Apostle Paul's life. So if you don't know anything about the Apostle Paul, this is going to be a lot of information. I'm going to break it up into as many parts as possible. I'm actually thinking about doing it for the whole year because, believe it or not, there's that much information about the Apostle Paul. There are scholars who specialize in Paul. They're called Pauline scholars, by the way. So I'm thinking about maybe stretching this out, maybe doing a video every week or so on Paul. So that'll be cool, particularly on his life, not necessarily on his doctrine or theology. So we'll talk more about that as time develops and as time goes on. The other thing is that we're going to get a little bit more into some practical issues, probably some Christian dating stuff, and spend a little bit of time talking about some churchy issues and try to talk about some of the Bible that has to do with the churchy issues. Because for those of you who are landing on this channel for the very first time, what you need to know about this channel is that, number one, this is a Bible study channel. Like, we're legit Bible study. We don't really play games or lollygag around. We just get straight to it and go full hardcore, full board. Nobody, there's nobody or nothing that's going to stand in our way. We just go straight for it. So, being that we are talking about branching out into some other issues, it's kind of new. So it's a big step. It's a big step to take, and it's a little risky because there's some very gray areas there. But I think that there's a lot of material that needs to be talked about. I think there's lots of discussions that we need to have on that stuff. So just so you know, in the future, the very near future, that is, we're going to be expanding, and we're going to start talking about Paul, the apostle, and his life. We're going to learn a lot about him, and we're going to be talking more about practical things and skills and tools and things of that nature that you can really use in real life, so to speak. Well, that's how people tend to think about it. So that's the future, and the future is coming really quick. So bear that in mind. But anyways, today we are going over Matthew chapter 17, and for those of you who have landed on this video for the very first time, this is a Bible study. We go over the entire chapter. We've gone all over the entire gospel all the way up to chapter 17. And today we're doing chapter 17. And tomorrow we're going to do 18 and then 19, all the way up to 28, because there's 28 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew. And we're reading through the entire Gospel of Matthew. And we're focusing on three things, which is spirituality, theology, and history. I always mix up the order. It's history, theology, and spirituality, or sometimes it's spirituality, theology, and history. It doesn't really matter. We kind of pick one or two or three or maybe four, or a lot of them, or none of them. Not none of them, but we pick one of them or three of them or whatever. The point is that we read the Bible and then we talk about it. And those are the three things that we pretty much talk about. And we learn stuff because learning's fun. So anyways, I want to make this video kind of short because sometimes they run pretty long, but I'm going to try and make this one short. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. But before we do, as tradition holds it in this series that we're doing, I always show this ugly picture because it makes me laugh. And as a side note, just so you know, right now I'm recording this video and I have a bunch of other stuff to do. And yesterday I actually didn't put out a video because I got too busy with other stuff and I just didn't have time to put out a video. So I skipped a whole day. And today I'm really busy as well, but I decided to make this video. And yeah, that's what I decided to do, even though I have other stuff. I actually have deadlines that I coming up very close on possibly missing. I might get into some trouble, but you know what? I missed yesterday and I can't miss today. So I'm making this video. Anyways, let's jump into Matthew chapter 17 and go ahead and read it. So this is Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13, and this is the Transfiguration. And as we have maintained all throughout the series, we have said over and over again, or I have said over and over again, that when Matthew wrote his gospel, he copied from Mark. In other words, he read Mark's gospel and copied it and put it in his gospel. And what we're actually seeing here on the screen with the Transfiguration is pretty much a copy of Mark chapter 9 with the Transfiguration. And we'll see in the next section where it talks about the demon-possessed boy. By the way, that story about the demon-possessed boy, which we were reading in a couple of minutes, is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. But it's my favorite story in Mark chapter 9, not in Matthew, because there's a little bit of a difference. And I mentioned this to you also. I said, I wanted you to read Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel side by side and compare them. And what I wanted you to do is pay attention to how Matthew made changes to Mark's gospel. So I hope you've done the exercise, and it's very good to learn that stuff. It's very important to know that stuff is actually there. And I hope you actually do those exercises and just don't take my word for it. You actually do the work yourself and go look for the evidence, because that's the best way to learn, is to look for the evidence. So we're going to go ahead and read up here in verse 1 of chapter 17, and this is the Transfiguration. And if you don't know what the Transfiguration is, well, guess what, buddy? You're getting ready to find out. Here's what it says. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter with him, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured by them. His face would shine like the sun, and his clothes became as white as snow, or white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will build up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. In verse 6, when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Then the disciples asked him, why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah has come and will restore all things. In verse 12, but I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. When they came down to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me, Jesus said. And Jesus rebuked the demons, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, Why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, Because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. By the way, verse 21 is gone. Okay, this is the NIV, and some other manuscripts they don't have that. Verse 22, because verse 21 is not there. In verse 22 here it says, when they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of the men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will rise or be raised to life. The disciples were filled with grief. Verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yes, he does, Peter replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? From others, Peter said. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. Verse 27. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and for yours. This story is very interesting when you consider some of the things that we've talked about in this series. One of the things that I've really tried to emphasize the most is the concept of John the Baptist starting the ministry. Jesus of Nazareth comes in, takes over that ministry, and then he trains the disciples how to do the ministry. It's important because John the Baptist made a mistake. He got involved in some politics, and he died. He got thrown in prison, and he got killed. Jesus saw that happen and said, I cannot make that same mistake, so I got to do something better. That's why he goes and gets the 12. We've talked about this as well. We talked about how the phrase, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men, makes sense historically when you realize that the disciples were disciples of John the Baptist. In other words, they already knew who Jesus was. This is not a miraculous thing. They already knew who he was. Jesus was offering the disciples a job. That's why they left their job. They left their job to go get another job with Jesus. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? So, it's interesting because, again, I think that what we're seeing here is Jesus is questioned about the tax. Peter is the one who's directly asked, but he's being asked about Jesus. So directly or indirectly, it's Jesus being asked, did Jesus pay the temple tax? And I think this is these are the types of points that go missing in church sermons. And that's why I love doing these Bible studies, because these are the things we get to talk about here. I've often told you that Jesus was trying to avoid the same mistakes as John the Baptist, a.k.a. getting arrested and then getting killed. One of the ways to get arrested is to not pay your taxes. Same thing is true today. So, Jesus is questioned about it. And what does he do? Well, he tells Peter, he says, look, dude, go down to the river, pick up some fish, open up their mouths, and there'll be some coins. Take those coins and go and pay the taxes. AKA, we're not trying to get arrested, bro. We don't want to die. Okay? So you go take care of it. Don't let us get killed. That's what Jesus is doing here. So that's what really makes this story very interesting, is how we're seeing these small little things here. Small little tiny things about Jesus not getting in trouble and avoiding this arrest. He knows it's going to happen. Also, the gospel writers tell us that he avoids it. I think it's in John's gospel, actually, where it says that they picked up stones to stone Jesus because he said, I am, or whatever. and he snuck away in the crowds. He hid in the crowds. Now, you just think about that story for a second, and it's like, wait a second. He's standing front row. Everybody's looking at him. They pick up stones to throw him at him, and he just magically disappears. Okay. I mean, but the point of the matter is, I don't know if that actually happened or not. It may have. It also may have not happened. But what I'll tell you is this. The gospel writer himself is trying to explain this problem of Jesus being arrested. We see it in Mark's gospel where he talks about them being trapped by the Pharisees. So it says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they came to Jesus and they tried to trap him in his words. We see the same types of things happening in Matthew's gospel. In other words, the gospel writers themselves, whether they're agreeing on the specifics, don't matter. What matters is what they're agreeing on. And what they're all agreeing on is that Jesus was trying to avoid being arrested, and they were trying to arrest him. These Jews were trying to arrest Jesus. He knew he would be arrested, and he's trying to avoid it. Okay? So this is primarily what the tax thing is about. It's about avoiding being arrested, because that's just a reason to get arrested. So that's what's important to understand about that. Obviously, this is a go-to passage for people who want to say you should pay your taxes, but I don't really think that's a good exegete of the passage. I think that there's a little bit more happening here than that. So that's very important. But I've also talked to you a lot in this series about Mark chapter 9 and how Matthew copied from Mark. And we don't have time to go and get Mark's gospel and go read Mark chapter 9 and compare it to what we see here on our screen. We don't have time for it. But he pretty much follows the story of the demon-possessed. And what I want you to do for some homework is I want you to open up the Gospel of Mark and read Mark chapter 9, and then read chapter 17, read the Mount of Transfiguration, and read the Jesus healing the possessed boy. And look at how Matthew just changes stuff. Not only does he change stuff, but he takes some stuff out. I will give you one example of what I'm talking about. When you open up Mark chapter 9, Jesus comes down the mountain, okay? And when he comes down the mountain, he sees this crowd. By the way, with the crowd are the other disciples, not Peter, James, John, but the other ones. And in the meantime, while Peter, James, and John and Jesus are up there on the mountain, down below the mountain is where the other disciples are with this old man who's trying to get this demon out of the child. And the disciples are praying for him, and they can't cast it out, okay? So, by the way, this is after Jesus gave them the power to heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, and cast out devils. This is important, so understand what I'm saying. Follow along with what I'm telling you. Pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you. This is very important to understand. Jesus sees the crowd coming toward him. And what does he do? He says, "Here I am." The father comes and brings the child. And he said, this is in Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 9. The father brings the child and he says, "Jesus, I brought my son to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Would you heal my son?" And Jesus says, "All things are possible for those who believe." Sounds good. And the old man says, I believe. Fix my unbelief." In other words, I believe, but I don't believe. I don't know. I mean, I just want my kid to be healed. I don't know what to do. Can you fix him? And so Jesus, at this moment, says, "Okay, well, whatever." And he turns to his disciples and he gets all pissed off at him and says, You idiots. It's basically what he says. And then he heals the child. Okay? He heals the child. Now, this is where things get a little bit interesting. Because when you come down here and you read this passage, do you know what we see? We see an entire conversation that's in Mark's gospel that we know Matthew's copying from, and he erases it. He just gets rid of it. I told you this before. When Matthew copies Mark, There are things that he finds in there that he just doesn't like, and so he just ignores them or doesn't write them down. In other words, he just scratches it off the list, says, I'm not putting that in my gospel. And that's what he does here. Here with the demon-possessed man, there is no story about this conversation between the man and Jesus, where he says, I believe, fix my unbelief. It's not here. He took it out. Matthew took it out. Now, why did he take it out? I don't know, but he took it out. I think it was kind of lame, because that's like the best part in the story. It's like, I believe, help my unbelief. But yeah, he took it out. So that's important to know. This is why I want you to read these gospel accounts, to read Mark's gospel and then read Matthew and compare them to one another, side by side, and read them. Okay? Because what you're going to find is Matthew made changes, and these changes are significant. These changes do matter. People talk about changes in the Bible all the time. They say, well, you ask them a question, do you think the Bible's reliable? And they say, no, I don't think the Bible's reliable. Okay, why don't you think the Bible's reliable? And they say, well, I think it's just been translated so many times and it's been changed so many times that it's just not reliable. Okay? Well, my question to those people is this. Show me where those changes are. Show me where the changes are. And the problem is that they can't show you where the changes are. And this is what I'm trying to teach you. I'm trying to teach you this the long way. I'm going the long way around to teach you, because here's the thing. Most people don't want to do the work. Most people don't want to open up the Bible and actually read it. So I'm trying to force you to do it by manipulating you to do it. Actually, I'm not really manipulating you. I'm just telling you you should do it. Here's the thing. When you read Mark's gospel and you read Matthew's gospel and you compare them to one another, you're going to find changes, significant changes. You're going to find mistakes. And that's exactly what you're finding here in the story of the demon-possessed boy. Also, by the way, I should add that in Mark's gospel, Jesus turns and says what? This demon, he turns to his disciples after he casts the demon out, and because they asked him, they said, Lord, how come we couldn't cast this demon out? What does Jesus say? He says, this demon can only come out by fasting and prayer. I'll tell you a little note about this fasting and prayer thing. People don't think that changes matter. Here's something interesting. That phrase in Mark's gospel, fasting and prayer, it's actually a textual variant. Prayer, the fasting part, the fasting part, that's a variant. In other words, a scribe who was copying it added that on there, we could say, right? That's one way to explain a variant. And it actually, the earliest manuscripts that we have do not say by fasting and prayer. It just says by prayer, right? And so it makes you wonder, how many people have actually tried to cast out demons by fasting and prayer? But then they realize, wait a second, the Bible doesn't even say fasting and prayer. This is why it's important to do your research, folks, because you end up making mistakes. So, when you read Mark chapter 9, what you'll see are changes. You can, in Matthew chapter 17, you'll see changes. And these changes are very important because they definitely happen. So when people talk about changes, they say, oh, well, it's been changed and changed and changed so many times. Great, show me where the changes are. The problem is that you can't. And the reason why you can't is because you don't know where the changes are. And the reason why you don't know where the changes are is because you don't want to read your Bible. And you don't want to do the hard work. You don't want to take Mark and you don't want to take Matthew and put them side by side and read them and critically think about them. You don't want to study them. Instead, what you want to do is whatever it is you want to do. I don't know what you want to do. But when you study the Bible, this is particularly the Gospels, this is how you really need to study the Gospels. Side by side, reading them critically and comparing the stories in details. Because it's important to understand that Matthew changed it. We're not going to sit here and argue that there's no changes made. We're not going to argue that Matthew didn't change the account of Mark. We're not going to argue that because we already know that. We already know he changed it. We can see it. Literally. If you don't believe me, pause the video, open up your Bible, go read Mark chapter 9, and read Matthew chapter 17, and compare them to one another. And everything that I've told you in this video, you'll find out is actually true. Okay, it's not art. Plus, I told you that Mark chapter 9 is my favorite story in the Bible, so This is my favorite story in the New Testament, that is. So I don't have it memorized by heart, but I know it pretty well. And I know that Matthew made changes to that story. Not only because I can read it, but because it's one of my favorite stories and I know it pretty well. Besides the point, he makes changes. We know that. Let's just accept it. I know fundamentalists and some crazy evangelicals, they don't want to admit that. Look, that's a horrible thing to do. My advice to you is just to admit the evidence and say, look, the evidence is there. We know he made changes. Let's move on to something bigger and better, which is, why did Matthew make changes to Mark's gospel? Why did he leave out this conversation? Why is it that Mark is saying, hey, Jesus has a conversation with the old man, and the old man says, I believe, help my unbelief. Why does Matthew leave that out? This is where you need to start thinking, because now you start interacting with the accounts. Now you start thinking about things critically. Now you start to think, well, maybe Matthew changed it and he took it out because it wasn't necessary to his narrative. Maybe Matthew didn't have a strong ideology of fathers. Maybe Matthew, you can start making up theories if you want to, or you can go look at what other scholars have had to say. And this is where studying the Bible and learning the Bible and thinking about the Bible critically becomes very fun, because you find problems like these in the Bible. Okay, we're just going to call it a problem. We find problems like these in the Bible, and then we think about them. And it's amazing how much information you can find, and it's amazing how much spirituality you can find in these changes. See, because it's not just the characters of the Bible that you're reading about, but it's also about the people who wrote the Gospels. It's about this guy named Mark. We don't know who he is. We just call him Mark. It's about this guy named Matthew. We don't know who Matthew was. We just know his name was Matthew. We don't know who they were as people, but we're reading their writings. We're seeing their thoughts. They were reading these different Gospels, and they were reading these different accounts, and they made decisions based on what information to put. They made decisions on what information to put into their books and what information to take out. People look at that as a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It starts to tell us about these authors. It starts to tell us about who they are. We can start thinking about them as people. So not only are we reading stories about Jesus in Matthew's gospel, not only are we reading stories about the disciples, not only are we reading stories about John the Baptist, but we're also reading stories about the people who wrote the Gospels. That's spectacular. That's one of the most, that's the biggest, one of the biggest treasures of the Bible, and almost nobody ever talks about it. They never actually talk about the author of the book. They never talk about the biblical author. They just don't. And it's the worst thing, because here's the thing. If you believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, you mean that God spoke and used he used his Holy Spirit to come upon man and write the Bible, you also have to think about something else. Why did God pick these men? If you believe it's inspired, you also have to believe that men wrote it, right? Because it's inspired. That's what inspiration means. It means God helped these human authors write it. But you also have to understand, in that means that God picked those human authors to write the Bible. And so you're reading a Bible that you think is inspired, and you've never asked the question, who were these men? That, my friends, is a big, big thought. That, my friend, is a missing piece to the puzzle. It's a missing piece that you don't have. You'll never understand the Bible until you begin to understand the authors who wrote it. You must understand the human authors. You must understand these people that we call Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and so on and so on. You must understand who they are as people, as human beings. You have to understand what they're trying to do. We know there's changes. We know there's differences. It's why we call it the synoptic problem. It's nothing to get upset about, right? You have to get over that hurdle and say, there's changes, there's differences, there's contradictions, there's discrepancies, whatever you want to call them, I don't care. You realize that those problems are there. You don't throw the whole thing out and say, well, it's all hopelessly flawed. You start to realize this was written by a human, And a human had a purpose for writing this stuff. We have to figure out, as Bible readers and students of the Bible, we have to figure out why they made these changes. That's our goal for reading the Bible. Because we're not just reading stories about Jesus and John the Baptist and the disciples and great miracles. We're also reading stories about the men who wrote the Bible. It's one of the biggest treasures in the entire Bible. And it's one of the things I hope that you learn throughout this course. I hope that, through this lesson here, I hope that you come to realize that the author of the book is just as important as the people in the book that you're reading about. Well, I've enjoyed this lesson. I think it's been awesome. It's been great. It's been fun for me, and I hope it's been fun for you, and I hope you've learned some stuff. I hope your mind has been expanded, and you are, doors are opening up for you to go explore new things. Because I tell you this, when you get into the Bible and you start reading it, you will find new things. You will start exploring. Doors will open up. They will open up, and you'll learn. You'll learn lots of stuff. And the biggest place you're going to learn is when you start taking one gospel and compare it to another gospel and start critically thinking about it and trying to find problems and then trying to understand why those problems are there. And it's a skill that you must learn. If you want to be a great Bible reader, if you want to be a great Bible teacher, if you want to be a great preacher, if you want to be a great evangelist, this is a skill that you have to learn. You must learn this skill. You must be an expert at this skill. You will never understand the Bible without doing this. It's a fact. Pure and simple. You must learn this skill. Anyways, tomorrow we're going to be going over Matthew chapter 18. And then after that, there's only 10 chapters left. Sounds like a lot, but it's really not. So, yeah, I look forward to them tomorrow. I hope you look forward to tomorrow. If this is the first time you ever landed on one of my videos, go ahead and click subscribe. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Hit the like button and tell me that you liked it. And drop a comment. If you learned something, if it helped you, if it inspired you, if it's encouraged you in some way, let me know. I like reading comments. I like reading the stories. So type away. Tell me something cool. Make my day, okay? If I've made your day, you should make my day. It just makes sense to do that like that. But anyways, it's been fun. I've enjoyed this, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordanclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.